All right. Good morning. Welcome to Friday, the best day of the week. Well, any day we get to do history is the best day, though, right? No? Ouch. It got me. That got me right here. Got me right here. Um, so, yeah, let's just dive in here. So again, this was from Tuesday, because of course we had Wednesday off, and now Thursday was a quiz, and today's Friday. So if you'll remember from Tuesday, we were talking about genocide, right? So we read a little bit about the Holocaust in Nazi Germany, Hitler, and the Nazi Party's attempts to basically wipe out German people in Europe, right? And so we read very quickly about how the first attempts were simply just to push Jewish people out of the country, and so they tried to deport them. But of course, Hitler and his Nazis weren't the only anti-Semitic people at the time, right? Lots of other countries were full of people who had prejudice against Jewish people. And so there was lots of countries that just wouldn't take any Jewish refugees. And so when the Germans couldn't really deport them, they started to put them into camps, right? And eventually they started to put them into camps where the sole purpose was just to kill them, right? And so we read about lots of people being killed in very inhumane ways, being shot or set upon by dogs and then shot. Of course, at many of these death camps, the sort of most popular method of execution was a gas chamber, right? And so they would just herd a bunch of people into a room like this, gas them, and then incinerate their bodies, right? And then sell the ashes to put on the roads during winter, right? Which is, right? The whole thing is awful, right? And again, we said that at the end of World War II, the United Nations sits down and starts to talk about what's happened, right? Because what will happen, spoiler alert, but what will happen is, of course, the Allies will enter Germany toward the end of the war, right? The British and the French, and well, mostly the British and the Americans and the Canadians, they'll enter Germany from the west. The Soviets will enter Germany from the east, and they'll kind of meet halfway. But in the process of kind of entering Germany, they're going to come across some of these camps, right? And they're going to see for themselves what's been happening. And so it's quite a shock. It's quite a horrible thing. It's quite a horrible thing. And so, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. And so the United Nations sits down to try to describe this crime that has happened, right? To sort of create some international standards so that people can be punished later on for this type of behavior, right? And they call it genocide. And it's important to, man, they're noisy over there, hey? What's that? Yeah, I didn't think, is that new? Was there always a gap? It's new. Oh well. Okay. So I'll try to talk louder than them. So genocide has been defined here as doing these four things, right? When you're systematically killing members of a group, or if you create a living condition whereby they can't survive, or when you prevent births, or when you actually take children from one group and raise them in a different group, okay? All of those things, whether you do some of them or all of them or a few of them, all of that counts as genocide, because you are trying to basically extinguish a certain group of people, right? You're trying to destroy them one way or the other. And it could be for racial or ethnic reasons, it could be for religious reasons, it could be any number of things, right? But you're taking a certain group of people and you're trying to, good morning, and you're trying to destroy them, okay? Now, we read an article on Tuesday, and we said that we should pay attention to this, right? Because even though the Holocaust was horrible and people were rightly horrified by what they discovered in Nazi Germany at the end of the war, it certainly wasn't the first genocide, and it wasn't the last either, right? So after World War II, here there were 43 genocides. Should I tell him to zip it over there? Okay.
Let's go.
Usually, I'm disappointed though, because usually it's me who's the loud one, and so people are always complaining about me. But I don't know. I feel bad now. Like, ugh, I feel dirty all over. Ugh. Okay. Anyway, so there's been lots of genocide since this time, right? And so again, we should pay attention to it, because it wasn't over after that, right? People continued to try to destroy other groups of people for the rest of the 20th century, right? So in the article we read, there was 8 stages of genocide, and they said that these stages are important because not only do they help us to recognize when a genocide might be coming, but there's also ways to stop it all the way along, right? There are useful tools we can use, because as we said on Tuesday, genocides don't just happen by accident, right? They don't just come out of nowhere and whoops, a genocide. They are planned, right? And they take a long time to organize. And so we need to pay attention to them so that we can stop them, right? So I asked you these questions here, and I think what I'll do is I'm going to leave it for now. Actually, no, I'm not going to leave it for now, because let's look at that article again very quickly, okay? Let's look at that article very quickly. So it's in Microsoft Teams. It was the 8 stages of genocide. Let's look at it, because we haven't looked at it for a few days. And you told me on Tuesday, I think, that the first stage of genocide was simply it was classification, right? So basically the idea that we have different groups of people in society, right? And pretty much every society is like this, right? No society is homogeneous. Everyone has different groups. And so that's kind of a normal thing, right? The next step was symbolization, right? Where some people are distinguished from others by some kind of symbol or some way that they dress, right? Maybe an important example of this might be the hijab, right? Or head coverings worn by Muslim women, right? That's a symbol, right? It's a symbol of their faith, and it makes them very identifiable in public, right? We see someone wearing a head covering, we usually make the assumption that they are Muslim, right? And often we're correct in that assumption, right? If you see someone wearing a turban, often this is someone who's a Sikh, right? And you make that assumption. And so these symbols kind of serve to kind of represent these people's, well, in this case, religion or ethnicity, but they also kind of mark them in society, right? We can very easily point out, oh, there's a Sikh, there's a Muslim, there's a Jew, right? We can very easily single them out. Now, none of those are entirely bad. Those first two aren't entirely bad. Again, as long as, in terms of the symbolization, as long as it's not being imposed on people, right? So Sikhs wear turbans, of course, but the Canadian government isn't making them wear it, right? They're wearing it because of their own choice and their religious beliefs. And so that's okay, but we still have to recognize that they are more visible in society because they wear these things, right? The third one, of course, is where alarm bells should start to ring, right? And that's dehumanization. And so this is where sometimes the government or sometimes far-right political groups, they start to create a picture of certain groups of people as less than human, right? Because the idea here is that people don't actually want to kill other people, that most of us have kind of a most of us are kind of against killing other people. And so if we want that to happen, we have to make it seem like they're less than human. Anyone watch Black Mirror? No? It's a twisted show. Okay, if you haven't seen it, I won't go into it. So it's this process of trying to make people less, right? Less than human. And we saw some of that. I showed you some Nazi propaganda, and we saw Jewish people being dehumanized, right? In some cases, they were, the propaganda images had them looking like ogres or monsters or devils. Some propaganda images compared them to lice, right? To sort of parasites or vermin. Either one of those works, right? Whether you're trying to make these people almost like supernatural monsters or whether you're trying to make them pests or vermin, either way you're dehumanizing them. You're making them not human. And things that are not human are much easier to treat badly and kill, right? So yeah, alarm bells should start ringing, right? And then, I won't go into too much detail here, but the article takes us through all of these other stages, right? Organization, right? So the genocide is organized, lists are created, militias are formed, militias are armed, right? People start to get in, they start to get ready, right? Because something's coming, right? Something's going to happen. Polarization, right? Where the two sides of society are kind of pushed apart, right? We're seeing a lot of this in the US and Canada right now, right? Where people on the right and people on the left are kind of trying to split people into two camps rather than kind of promoting unity, right? But we can see that happening too. Then there's preparation, right? Where people are getting ready for the genocide, separating out those who are going to be executed. And then finally, the extermination begins, right? And so sometimes these militias might head out and start shooting people or killing people. People might be sent off to prison camps to be executed there, but the killing begins, right? And then the last stage, of course, is denial. Okay, and this always happens at the end of a genocide, and sometimes it happens for years and even decades after. So it's not something that happens right at the end. It persists as people continue to deny that it ever happened. Right? So the people who committed the genocide will often try to destroy the evidence or bury the evidence. People will run away or hide in other countries. People will claim that nothing happened. People will claim that, oh, it was just a civil war, or it wasn't as bad as people said it was. People will go to all kinds of different lengths to act as if it never happened, right? Just on a somewhat personal note here, one of the solutions to this is to is to send witnesses to document what happened. And so, if you know anything, there was a genocide in Rwanda in 1994. And so there were two groups of people, Tutsis and Hutus, which kind of, originally it was kind of an occupational class, but later it became almost like an ethnicity kind of thing. The Tutsis had held power in Rwanda for decades, but the Hutus had recently regained power. And then they went about planning a genocide to murder the Tutsis. And they very effectively pulled it off. In about I think a 2-month period, about 800,000 people were killed. And Canada has some connection with this because the head of the UN force that was in Rwanda at the time, he was a Canadian who later became a senator. So he was there, and he was one of the ones calling on the United Nations to do something, right? So this soldier, Romeo Dallaire, this general, he said, look, I see all the warning signs. Something bad is going to happen here, and we need more reinforcements to protect the people. But nobody really wanted to get involved, and he could barely do anything about it, right? So he and his UN team, who I think were mostly Belgians, they did manage to save and protect some people, but they were really too small to do anything, and so they had to stand by and watch, thousands and thousands of people murdered. When I was in university, my anthropology professor was actually one of the people they sent over as part of a witness team. So after the genocide was over, my professor went over with the UN basically to document what had happened. He was an anthropologist, a forensic anthropologist, so he really knew human bones and stuff like that. And he was telling us about it in class one day, and he said it was everywhere you went, you found bones and skeletons. Like, you just pull over by the side of the road and go behind a bush, and you'll find bones behind there. And it was just, nearly 1 million people were killed, right, in no time at all. And of course, there was an attempt to cover up and deny that anything had happened, but part of his job and the team's job was to tour around Rwanda and create a report, right, to say that we saw this, right, this happened. These people are now, hundreds of thousands of people are now dead, right? And so, and I think, from his impression, I think it really kind of disturbed him. Like, I think it was even difficult for him to talk about after the fact. But yeah, so all of these things, again, we often think of the Holocaust when we think of genocide, and we should. It's a very bold, awful example. But again, there's lots of genocides, and there's lots of them that were, that are preventable. Because again, as the writers here who are associated with Human Rights Watch, or with Genocide Watch, they say that, these things don't happen by accident, right? They are carefully planned, and they take a lot of time to build. And if you pay attention, you can intervene, right? You can stop them from happening before they do. Which brings me to what I want to talk about today, okay? Who knows anything about, here in Canada, about Indian residential schools? A little bit? Avi? No? David? No? Anna? A little bit? Okay. I'm going to give you a very short history in this, okay? This is a long story, and there's lots of different parts to it. You will probably hear more in other classes, but I'm just going to give you enough so that we can deal with this, okay? When we talk about Indians here, we're talking about Canada's Indigenous people, okay? And Canada's Indigenous people were the first people here in North America. That's why we call them First People or First Nations. Their ancestors probably came here about 14,000 years ago from northeastern Asia. Okay, before that, Canada wasn't, or North America and South America weren't really accessible to humans in any way, and so there were no humans in North or South America at all until about 14,000 years ago or so. And those first people to arrive, they're the ancestors of the indigenous people, the First Nations who are here today. And so those people that came in spread throughout North and South America. They kind of evolved into many different cultures and languages and spiritual traditions and cultures. Even here in British Columbia, there's probably at least 12 or 13 indigenous languages that people would have spoken just in British Columbia, with about a dozen different cultures. And so North and South America were very kind of culturally rich before people who looked like me showed up here. But of course, once Christopher Columbus showed up, North and South America were colonized, right, by the British, by the French, by the Spanish, by the Portuguese, and indigenous people were kind of pushed aside, right? Their land was taken from them. They were, any sort of power they had was kind of stripped from them, and they were expected to assimilate. They were expected to become like us, or go away somehow, right? Whatever happened, there was really no room in a country like Canada or a country like the United States. There was really no room for these indigenous people. Okay, and part of this kind of pushing aside of indigenous people were Indian residential schools. Okay, so indigenous people had made a deal with the government, or a number of deals with the government early on, that was supposed to be a relationship where, okay, this is our land, we're indigenous people, this is our land, we're going to give you permission to come here and to live here and to thrive here. We'll give you our permission to do so, but in exchange for living on our land, you owe us certain things, and we would like you to give those things to us, right? And so the government and indigenous people signed treaties. They signed these agreements that this would be the relationship. But the Canadian government really didn't have any interest in upholding those agreements. Okay, I don't have time to go into it, unfortunately, but one of the pieces of those treaties were providing education for indigenous kids. Okay, so indigenous people were living here for thousands of years. They were living a very kind of naturalistic lifestyle. They were hunting and fishing and things like this. But as more and more Europeans came here, the country began to change, right? Towns and cities started to pop up, railways, factories, machines, roads. All of these things started to appear, and indigenous people knew that their life was changing, and their kids were going to need certain skills to live and to thrive in this new world, right? Which I think we can probably identify with, because I think that's all of our parents probably feel the same way, right? They're sending us to school because they know that we're going to need skills to, for the jobs of tomorrow, whatever that is, right? So we're all here kind of doing that. And indigenous kids were doing the same thing. They wanted, the indigenous people wanted the government to help educate their kids to live in this new kind of context. But unfortunately, the education that they wanted their kids to get isn't the education that they got. What these schools wound up being was not a place of education or love or care. What they wound up being is tools of assimilation. And the schools attempted to strip indigenous kids of their language and their culture, okay, to try to make them like us, okay. And in I don't know who said this, but you often hear this quote stated, is that the purpose of these schools was to kill the Indian in the child, okay? Which sounds brutal, and it is brutal. Um, most of these schools were run by church groups, some Catholic, some Protestant, and you can almost it almost seems like it's like a demon possession thing, right? You have to exorcise the demon, right? You have to drive the demon out of this person, and they took a very similar approach to these indigenous kids of trying to drive their indigenous culture and language and religion out of them. And so, it was a standard context like this, right? There were kids sitting in desks learning lessons. The schools were also boarding schools. And so these kids had to come to school and they would stay there for months and months at a time. And the schools were a long way away from where they lived, so they couldn't really go home and visit their parents on weekends at all. And that was intentional. So huge numbers of indigenous kids wound up in residential school. The residential schools were around for almost 100 years. The first one started showing up in about a little bit before 1876. The last one, believe it or not, closed in 1993. And so generations of indigenous kids went to schools like these. And again, while they were getting an education, and a very poor education at that, it wasn't the same education that white kids were getting. It was a shitty one. While that was happening, these kids were experiencing very high levels of emotional and physical and sexual abuse. Okay, thousands of children died at these schools for various reasons, which we're still trying to uncover and understand. That's a ridiculously high number, 6,000, right? The correct number of kids dying at school is 0 and will always be 0. But that number, even though it might seem high to you, is probably low. A lot of records weren't kept very well. We still don't have access to a lot of the records from residential schools. Many of them are held by the Roman Catholic Church, by the Vatican, and they haven't released them yet. And so we actually don't know what the number is, but it's probably higher than this. And if you've been following the news here in the last year or so, which you may not have been, you'll know that very recently they've started doing scans outside of where these Indian residential schools used to be. They use ground penetrating radar, and they found hundreds of unmarked graves outside of these schools. And so kids died at these schools and were buried out back with no grave marker, no notification to the parents, nothing, right? The kid died at school and they buried him out back, and that was it, right? And so it's kind of difficult to kind of overstate how bad these places were, right? And some people will try to defend them, right? Some people will say, oh, well, probably not every kid was abused, or I'm sure some of them got an education. And that might be true, but it certainly doesn't excuse the numbers that you see here, right? Thousands of kids went to school and never came home again, right? They never saw their parents again. Their parents never saw them. Their parents never even knew what happened to them because schools didn't bother to notify these parents, right? So again, it is difficult to understate how horrible these places were. Students at these schools were punished for misbehavior, which happens at schools, but particularly harshly for anything that had to do with their indigenous culture. So if they spoke any of their traditional language, if they tried to do anything that was cultural, dance or sing or whatever it was, any evidence of their of them acting in their indigenous culture was harshly punished. And again, you can see this is a pretty brutal. This is a pretty brutal situation, right? These kids were, these kids were basically sent to prison, right? And not an ethical one, right? And basically, what was happening here is, that the Canadian government was trying to destroy Indigenous culture, right? They wanted to assimilate Indigenous people into Canada, right? They wanted them to sort of go away somehow. And some people have argued that what's happened here is a cultural genocide. Okay? And again, that's probably a surprising thing to hear, because when you hear about Canada, the first word you think of is not genocide, right? We kind of market ourselves as a friendly country, right? We're very open, we're very multicultural. Sometimes we even put our Indigenous people first, right? If you look at any travel and tourism sites or brochures to BC, you'll see lots of Indigenous stuff, right? Totem poles and Indigenous art and things like that. So we kind of sell ourselves in a particular way, but there's a pretty dark chapter to our history here that is, people are now becoming aware of, but in the past weren't, right? And again, it's one that is associated with genocide, which is, that's what the Nazis did, right? So that's kind of uncomfortable, right? And so what I would like to do is this. I would like us to, this is a bit of a side detour in history, but it's one that has a comparison with where we are in World War II. I'd like to talk just a little bit about the idea of a genocide happening here in Canada, okay? And to do this, we're going to use our critical thinking skills, right? So remember the last time we talked about this, we said that critical thinking is about evaluating what people are asking us to believe, right? And again, that's kind of the magic question, right? Why should I believe that? What am I being asked to believe here? And so when we talked about it before, I'm just going to jump through this because you've seen it before. We talked about looking for arguments, right? And an argument had a conclusion, a main point, and it had premises, ideas that gave us a reason to believe that thing was true, right? And so what I would like you to do, knowing what we know about critical thinking and knowing that I've given you just the bare minimum of Indigenous history here in Canada, I'd like to read this article, and what I would like you to do is to answer these questions, which are not listed in my slides, but I think they're listed at the end of the article, and indeed they are. Okay, so I'm going to put them on the screen here so you can see them. Is it this one? There it is. So the first question here is this. What's the author's argument? Right? What do they want us to believe? Okay, what are they asking us to believe? Number two, this is where you kind of have to use your own thinking and your own imagination. Why might people want to reject this argument? Why might people not want to believe what this author is trying to convince us of? Okay. What about the consequences? What will happen if we believe this argument? Or what will happen if we don't believe it? Okay. What does the author say that should be done? How can we start to fix the relationship between Indigenous Canadians and non-Indigenous Canadians? And then finally, what do you think? Do you agree with this author, or do you not? Okay. So everything is kind of based around finding the argument, and then do we believe it or do we not? Why does it matter? Etc. Okay. So I will let you read the article. The article's in Microsoft Teams, of course. These questions are at the end of the article, so you can see them there. Okay. Okay, let's dig into this. If you have questions about anything that the article refers to or any words, just let me know and I'll help you out, okay? Okay, hardworking people, do you want to take a little break? Sorry, it's mid-stretch there. Okay, let's take a break and then we'll come back. We'll finish reading this and talk about it, okay? Okay, people. So we're officially back. Let's take a few more minutes to read, and then we'll talk. Okay. Okay, people, do you want to give this one a whirl? No? Yes? Maybe? Okay. So let's start out with the argument of this piece. What's the main thing that this author wants us to believe? What do they want us to believe?
He wants us to believe what happened to indigenous people and they as well.
Okay. Maybe we can be a little more precise than that. Anna, what do you think?
I don't know, maybe like he mentions how there are still Canadians that refuse to acknowledge all of that happened.
Yeah.
And that there are like these still policies that somehow create a genocide environment towards indigenous people now.
Right. So yeah, a lot of people don't seem to understand the history of Indigenous people in Canada, but also there are things that are still kind of maybe in the realm of genocide happening right now, right?
No.
Huh? Yeah. That's true. It's true. I don't think it's a conclusion yet, but it is true. It's something that the author is trying to provide to us. What do you think? Regina, do you have an idea? What do you think? What's that? Okay. Why are you laughing? Because you've got stuff in your mouth? Okay. David, what do you think? This is a tough one. There's a lot of stuff that is said in here. What do you think? Well, let's check. Sometimes a good way to kind of clue into the conclusion of an argument is with the title, okay? Because the title will sometimes it'll just tell you what the conclusion is right there. And this title doesn't do that, right? It's not really a statement, but it does say the ongoing legacies of Canadian genocide. So it does kind of imply that, yeah, genocide is an ongoing thing, like Anna told us. I don't know. I don't think we're quite there yet. Avi, we had I think you were probably closest to the mark. Do you remember what you said before?
Yeah, he wants us to believe that what happened.
Yeah.
Not forget about it and to know that it's wrong.
Yeah. So let's try and make that more precise. So not to forget about what happened and to know that it's wrong. But specifically, what kind of wrong is it?
Like wrong.
Yeah. But if we were to label this wrong, what would we call it?
Genocide.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, and I think that's what, this is Pamela here. I think this is what Pamela is arguing. I think she is saying that what happened in Canada in the past, and, even still in the present, even though a lot of people didn't really know about it, what happened should be considered a genocide. Right? That's what Regina was thinking when her mouth was full, right? Yeah, that's what I think Pamela is trying to convince us of, that we should think of what happened in Canada as a genocide. Okay. Now, again, as good critical thinkers, we should always ask ourselves, well, okay, why should we believe that? Why should we believe that we have had a genocide here in Canada? And so, does Pamela give us any reasons to believe that that's true? What does she give us? Why should we believe that what's happened in Canada is a genocide?
Because
She actually did give examples,
She gave examples?
like what really happens, like the 5 categories of genocide.
Oh, okay. That's in the sort of bold section?
Yeah, the first killing of members of the community.
Oh, okay. So, and we said that before too, right? Like the question of what is a genocide? Well, it's these things, right? If you do those things, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then those are genocidal acts, right? And what's Pamela doing here? Well, she's giving us very clear examples of things that Canada has done that fits those criteria, right? That fits those categories. And so, yeah, we should think of what's happened here in Canada, we should think of it as a genocide. Why should we believe that? Well, here's what a genocide is, according to the United Nations. It's doing these 5 things. And Canada has done those 5 things. Have they not? Yeah, right? And so I think that's probably the core of her argument here is the United Nations says that this is a genocide. Canada has done all of these things. Therefore, what's happened here should be considered a genocide. Right? And yeah, and I think that's correct, right? So, whoops, no, I don't have a slide on that. Interesting, very interesting. I think that's correct. I think that's what the argument here is. Do you think there's any other pieces of this argument? Do you think there are other premises, or is the rest of the information just kind of like context around the argument? Is there anything that you think we missed, or is that the core piece?
But the genocide is still ongoing.
Okay, so genocidal things and policies are still in place. Okay, well, let's see if it fits with the argument. So we should consider what happened in Canada. We should consider that a genocide. Why should we believe that? Because it's still going on.
no, we should believe that because this,
And it's still going on. Right, okay. So maybe not a premise, but kind of a thing that you would say after the argument, right? Yes, what's happened here in Canada is a genocide, and we should pay attention to this because it's still happening, right? There's still things being done, right? So yeah, not part of the argument, but an important kind of point to drive it home, right? We're not just talking about the past, we're talking about the present as well. Yeah. Anything else that fits in here as part of the argument? Again, there's a lot of important information here, but the what?
Canada is trying to bury, like, trying to act as if it's never.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So the idea that we're kind of in the 8th stage of denial here, aren't we? Or the 8th stage of genocide here, denial, right? People are trying to say that, oh no, that didn't happen, right? That's not what happened here. Actually, that's not bad, right? Because again, the conclusion is we should believe what's happened here in Canada is a genocide. Always ask ourselves the question, why should we believe that? Well, because we're actually in the 8th stage of it right now. We're in denial about the fact that it happened, Is that a good premise? I think it's not bad. I think it's not bad, right? How do you know that something? How do you know that you've had a genocide? If you are in one of the later stages, if people are denying that it happened. Although, I want to try these out next week. I have these, Tom loaned them to me. They're critical thinking cards. And I'm going to look over them on the weekend and try to figure out, I think it kind of gets played like a game sort of thing, like a card game, but I want to figure out how it works before we do it in here. But I think that one, that's kind of that's almost a circular logic thing, right? So I think you're right about the denial, but also the idea that somebody is saying it didn't happen can't be proof for the fact that it did, right? Like, let's say we have an exam and I accuse Anna of cheating, okay? And Anna says, no, sir, I didn't cheat. I didn't cheat at all. Oh, well, that's proof that you did, because of course someone who cheated would 100% say that they didn't. So it's proof. Is it really proof? No, right? Just someone saying they didn't do something is not proof that they actually did, right? So here, there could be a little bit of that as well, but also there's another part where we could say, yeah, we're actually in the final stage of a genocide. We're actually denying that it ever happened. And so that's part of the process. So you could kind of go at that one either way. I think it's not bad, but also denying something something happened isn't proof that it actually did. So it's so. Not bad. I think we've got it, though. I think we've got the basis of the argument here. Now, my next question, of course, is why might people want to reject this argument? Why might people not want to believe it?
Because nowadays Canada is not seen as that type of country of people.
Okay.
So they don't want to spoil their name.
They don't want to spoil their
Name or reputation. Because it just doesn't suit them.
Yeah. So here in Canada, we've kind of marketed ourselves, and not only have we marketed ourselves, but we think of ourselves that way, right? We're not trying to sell other countries on some we're not catfishing other countries, right? We know, like we really think of ourselves as, multicultural and accepting and open, right? And in many ways that's true. Everything okay? Who is there? Hello? Oh, okay. Maybe I'll come back. Hello? So, yeah, we market ourselves differently, right? We're supposed to be an open, multicultural, tolerant country, and this is pretty off-brand for us, right? A genocide is pretty off-brand for Canada, and so some people might not want to believe it, right? Because they believe that Canada is an open, tolerant, accepting country. And of course there's some truth to that, right? I think we are, for the most part, but that doesn't mean we don't have a genocide in our past, right? So yeah, this is off-brand for us, right? This is not who we sell ourselves as. It's not who we believe ourselves to be. Why else might people want to disagree with this argument? Why else might people want to disagree with this argument? How do you think how do you think it might make Canadians feel if their country had perpetrated a genocide? How might we feel about that as Canadians? Mad?
Bad.
Bad?
Maybe ashamed.
Yeah?
Because it's comparable to the Holocaust.
Yeah, right? So now our country and our people are being compared to the Nazis, right? And the Holocaust. That might make us feel ashamed, right? Or guilty. We might not want to feel that way, right? We might want to say, no, that didn't happen here. Are you kidding? We're not Nazis, right? We didn't exterminate indigenous people in gas chambers. That's not us. Yeah. People might feel ashamed. Why else might people disagree with this argument or want to reject it? So we might be ashamed. It's kind of off-brand for us. Maybe the last part is the idea that genocide's kind of a heavy word, hey? Like, to be accused of genocide it's a bad thing, right? You didn't cross this. You didn't run a stop sign. Like, genocide is a big thing, right? And people have a lot of negative, or can have a lot of negative reactions to it, and they should, right? They should have negative reactions to it. But yeah, it might be harder to accept something like that just because it's so big, right? It's so awful. It's such a heavy concept. It's hard to think about the fact that your country has done this, right? What happens, do you think, if we believe this argument? What happens if we say, okay, we agree there has been a genocide here in Canada?
Some people will be happy, some people will
True, right? Some people will, well, I'm not sure anyone will necessarily be happy about it, but
But like indigenous people will be at least like, they'll accept it.
okay. Yeah, that might be actually nice for indigenous people to hear, right? One of the things that's mentioned in this article is kind of mending the relationship between indigenous and non-indigenous Canadians, right? And part of that, if you're in any relationship, whether it's friends or girlfriends or boyfriends or whatever, if you do something wrong, the first step to apologizing and to fixing the relationship is to actually admit what you did, right? You have to say, I'm sorry, and you have to say, I'm sorry that I did this thing, right? Some people like to apologize and say, oh, I'm sorry you're upset about that. That's not an apology, right? I'm sorry you're upset that I, stayed out late last night or whatever. That's not an apology, right? The apology is, I'm sorry that I stayed out late, right? I'm sorry that my behavior upset you. That's the apology. But in part, you have to actually admit what you did wrong. You have to know what you did wrong, and you have to admit it. You have to say, yes, I did this thing, and I'm sorry, right? That was wrong. That was thoughtless of me. And so I apologize, right? So if we're going to sort of repair our relationship with Indigenous Canadians, we need to at least be able to admit what happened, right? If you can't admit what happened, you can't apologize. If you can't apologize, then no hope for the relationship, right? The relationship will not get any better if we can't say sorry. And we can't say sorry unless we can say what we did or what has happened, right? So yeah, if we accept this argument, that's the first step towards repairing the relationship, right? And as you can probably guess, if we don't accept this argument, if we reject it, then what happens? It's kind of the opposite, right? Nothing gets fixed, right? The relationship doesn't get repaired because we can't even admit what we did wrong, and therefore we can't apologize, or our apologies are hollow, right? Yes, indigenous people, we're sorry you're upset. We're sorry you're so angry about that. Anyway, let's move on. Bad apology, right? Awful. So, yeah, if we accept an argument like this, it allows us to move forward. Right? If we reject it, tough to fix. Right? Tough to fix. Let me just jump to the end here. What do you think? Does Pamela make a good argument here? Do you believe her? Yeah. When we said, back when we were starting to talk about critical thinking, we said that we should evaluate every argument, right? We said that we should look and make sure that the premises are true and that they are logical support for the conclusion, right? So if we look at Pamela's premises, she said that we should believe that a genocide has happened here in Canada because the UN says that this is a genocide and that Canada has done all of these things, right? And so, is it true that that's what the UN said a genocide was? That is true. You kind of have to trust me on this one because I'm the one who told you. You can look it up. There's the convention of, the UN's Convention on Genocide is publicly available. You can look it up. So yeah, that's true. And I can also tell you that the examples that she gives, even though they sound quite awful, those are true too. Right? And again, they didn't happen to every single Indigenous person, and they didn't happen at all points in time from over the past 200 years. They happened at different times to different people, but they are all true. They all did happen at one time or another. So the premises are true. Are they logical support for the conclusion? Right? Should we believe that a genocide happened if this is what a genocide is, and then Canada did all those things? Is that good logical support? Yeah, right. So Pamela's made she's made a logical, sound argument here, right? What do you think? Do you believe her? Do you agree with what she's telling you? Should we think of this as a genocide? What do you think, Regina? Abby's nodding. Are you on the fence a little bit? Yeah. Anna, what do you think?
I would agree with her.
Would you? Yeah. David, what do you think? Yeah. Do I agree with her? Well, she's made a solid argument, right? When, things are only what we define them to be, right? And if we're going to say that that's what a genocide is, it's very true that Canada has done those things, right? And she also points out a number of things that are kind of not directly part of her argument, but they're kind of addressing the other side, right? It doesn't matter if it happens over a short period of time, right? The Holocaust did, the Rwandan genocide did. It doesn't matter if it's a short period of time, right? There's no level by which, oh, it's okay, I only killed 8,000 people, so it's not a genocide. It doesn't work that way either. There's no number barrier, right? And your intent doesn't matter. Your intent and your completion don't matter either. So it doesn't matter if you were trying to commit a genocide. That doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter if you were successful or not, right? Hitler wasn't successful. There's still lots and lots of Jewish people around. Less than there used to be, but there's still lots and lots of Jewish people around. So Pamela is saying, my argument is that this is what a genocide is, and Canada did it. And it doesn't matter if they did it over a long period of time. It doesn't matter if they didn't manage to destroy Indigenous cultures. It doesn't even matter what their intent was. Although, I want to draw your attention to this. There's a quote in the article, and I think it's right on the second page? Yeah, it's on the second page. And it's by the Deputy Superintendent of the Department of Indian Affairs. So this is the government minister who's in charge of Indigenous people. And he said He said Indian children die at a much higher rate in residential school than in their villages. But this alone does not justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared toward a final solution to our Indian problem. That's a pretty uncomfortable thing to say, right? Because of course the Nazis had a final solution as well. And of course this is in 1918, so it's well before the Nazis, and so this guy Duncan Campbell Scott couldn't have known what Hitler was going to do and what Hitler was going to say. But that's pretty uncomfortable, right? For the Canadian government to say a final solution to our Indian problem, right? That smells like a genocide, right? And again, yeah, kids are dying at a high rate in your schools, but that doesn't mean you're going to change your policy. Then what will make you change your policy, right? This is pretty clear evidence that they knew what was going on, and either they were trying to make it happen, or even if they weren't trying to make it happen, they didn't stop it, right? They continued to allow it to happen. And again, that's Pamela's point too. It doesn't matter if you're trying to commit genocide. It doesn't matter if you're just following rules because you're a member of the military or a member of the government. And it doesn't even matter so much if you don't do anything at all, right? If you're complicit, if you just say, okay, I'm just going to pretend I don't see this, right? You're still responsible, right? So, yeah, I think she makes a good argument. And as much as I hate to think of this happening here, I think this happened here. 100%. Okay, I'm very sorry I went 2 minutes over. I apologize. I don't want to take your lunch. I hope you have a nice weekend. Enjoy yourselves. Try and get some fresh air. Relax. Get some sleep. And I'll see you on Monday, okay? Okay, that is all.